Things were gravely off balance in our new family dynamic. After my mother's death, I discovered that my father had redirected the entire college fund she had set aside for me to my stepsister, Eleanor. This revelation came as a harsh blow, especially since this fund was built through my mother's life insurance and their shared savings, intended to secure my educational future. Feeling betrayed and lost, I was struggling to come to terms with my father's actions when my grandparents stepped in. They were equally shocked by what had happened and decided to gift me $9 million, a gesture meant to rectify the imbalance and ensure that my future remained bright. However, the situation escalated when my father demanded that I share this new inheritance with Eleanor, arguing that it was only fair. This turn of events left me dumbfounded. My life, which once seemed normal, suddenly mirrored the dramatic twists often found in Reddit threads I read, where real life seemed stranger than fiction. I found myself at a crossroads, feeling lost in a situation that seemed too surreal to be true. Now, I turned to this community, seeking advice and perspective. The past events, marked by loss and unexpected changes, have shaped a complex landscape that I find difficult to navigate alone. Your insights could help me unravel this tangled web and perhaps find a way to address the situation with my father and stepsister, fostering understanding in a dynamic that has deeply affected us all. About a year ago, on Eleanor's birthday, I found myself in a minor car accident. When my dad arrived at the hospital several hours later, his agitation was palpable, not because I was hurt, but because the accident had ruined Eleanor's birthday celebration. This incident was not just about that day. It represented a culmination of moments where I felt increasingly sidelined by my father. As time passed, the emotional toll of such incidents led me to accept that my relationship with my father and his new family would never be the same. This realization became clearer when I graduated from high school. I was already exploring scholarships and part-time jobs to fund my college education, not expecting any support from him. Shockingly, I discovered that he had diverted the education fund, painstakingly built by my mother, to Eleanor. He justified this by claiming she needed it more, leaving me to figure something out. This betrayal was more than financial. It was a profound breach of trust, and the bond one thought we still shared. My mother had created that fund with love, aiming to secure a bright, worry-free future for me. In one swift move, my father had dismissed its purpose, handing it over to Eleanor as if it were a trivial matter. The devastation of this act was immense, felt like a deep personal attack. Reeling from this, I ceased all communication with my father. It felt like the ultimate betrayal, irreparable. However, an unexpected support came from my grandparents, who had always been a quiet presence in my life. Their reaction to the situation was fierce. My usually calm granddad and peacemaking grandma were outraged. They stepped in decisively, presenting me with a check for $9 million, an incredible gesture showing that they had been secretly setting aside funds for me, anticipating a time when I might need them. This support was more than financial. It was a profound affirmation that I was not alone. My grandparents were ready to help me rebuild, a stark contrast to my father's actions. When he eventually learned of the check, his reaction was one of fury. He demanded that I share the money with Eleanor, accusing me of selfishness. This accusation, coming from him, only further solidified the divide between us. It was a painful, yet clarifying moment that showed me where I truly stood and who genuinely had my back. Having had more than my share of trials, I found myself utterly dumbstruck by the audacity of his request. He had already claimed what was rightfully mine and gifted it to Eleanor as casually, as if it were nothing. Now, he was asking me to relinquish a precious gift for my grandparents as well. The sheer nerve of it left me reeling. I refused outright. There was no way I would part with a single dime. I had already been deprived of what was intended for me, the future my mother had tirelessly secured for me. The inheritance from my grandparents was my last bastion, my sole avenue to a future that felt increasingly out of reach. I owed Eleanor nothing. I certainly owed him nothing. He had taken more than enough from me. Yet, my father didn't view it that way. He launched into a prolonged, emotional plea, trying to coax me into reconsideration. He invoked my mother's memory, saying she would be disappointed in me, that I was failing her by not assisting someone in need. He wielded her memory like a weapon, portraying her as a saint who would have selflessly handed over the funds without a second thought, suggesting I was betraying her legacy by not doing the same. His words shook me, leading me to question my resolve. Was I being too unyielding? After all, my grandparents' generosity had left me well provided for, covering my educational needs and more. A part of me wondered if perhaps sharing a little wouldn't be so detrimental. Maybe my mother would have wanted me to help Eleanor. Guilt and confusion gnawed at me, but memories of years filled with neglect and being overlooked flooded back. I recalled how my father had consistently dismissed my feelings, favoring Eleanor repeatedly, leaving me to cope alone. In that moment, I reaffirmed my decision. I told my father I wouldn't give Eleanor any of the money. He could label me selfish if he chose, but I refused to be manipulated into forfeiting what was mine. I would not be guilted into sacrificing my future for someone who had already cost me dearly. Despite my firm stance, inner conflict still plagued me. Eleanor's constant texts, her claims of our special bond, only deepened my turmoil. A part of me still questioned whether I was being too harsh, too unforgiving. Perhaps Eleanor, caught in the middle of our family drama, was also a victim in her own right. And yet, how much was I expected to give? How many losses must I endure before I could rightfully put myself first? These questions haunted me as I wrestled with the notion of generosity against the backdrop of my own needs and the legacy of a mother who had always put others before herself. I find myself questioning whether my feelings are just a reflection of my own selfishness, letting the pain and betrayal obscure my judgment. After everything that has unfolded, it's become nearly impossible for me to relent. Not this time. Therefore, I am reaching out to seek your perspective. Am I wrong to refuse? Should I share the money with Eleanor despite everything that has happened? Or am I justified in holding my ground and keeping what I truly believe is rightfully mine? I'm at a point where I'm genuinely unsure. Following the recent upheaval involving my father, I chose to stay with my grandparents temporarily. I needed an escape from the ongoing negativity and to surround myself with those who genuinely care for my well-being. My grandparents have always been a strong pillar of support for me, and currently, they're the ones I trust the most. I confided in them about everything: how my father misused my education fund, his insistence that I split the inheritance from my grandparents, and even his attempts to guilt-trip me by invoking memories of my mother. I initially felt angry, but seeing my grandparents' outrage made me realize that my feelings of betrayal were valid. Many have asked, and yes, these are my paternal grandparents, which perhaps makes the situation even more painful for my father, knowing that his own parents disagree with his actions. This has to be a difficult realization for him, and honestly, he brought it upon himself. He's been so caught up with his new family that he's neglected those who were always there for him. My grandparents remember, and they're firmly by my side, further fueling my father's anger. They've offered me considerable advice, strongly recommending that I engage a financial advisor. Initially, I hesitated, feeling it might be excessive. However, the more they elaborated, the clearer it became that they were correct. Being young and inexperienced with managing a significant amount of money, I could easily make costly mistakes or worse, lose it all. Especially considering the recent turmoil with my father and Eleanor, it's evident how susceptible one can be to manipulation when emotions run high. My grandparents argue that having a professional to manage my finances would provide clarity and protect against exploitation. Convinced by their arguments, I've decided to look into hiring a financial advisor this week. But that's not all. Recently, my grandfather and my father had a heated phone argument. What started as a calm discussion quickly escalated when my father began to justify his actions. My grandfather couldn't contain his disappointment, accusing him of failing as a parent and prioritizing his new family over me, his daughter. I wasn't part of the call, but I could hear my grandfather's furious voice from the next room. He was incensed that my father had misused funds intended for me and did not hesitate to call him out for his actions. My father, as usual, didn't take the criticism well. Deep down, He must know he's made mistakes, but his pride prevents him from admitting it. Instead of apologizing or acknowledging his faults, he remains defensive. He emphatically reiterated that Eleanor was as deserving as I was, accusing me of ingratitude. It was hard enough to hear such words from my grandfather, but what truly pained me was Sophia's reaction, or rather, her lack of one. I had always viewed Sophia as a reasonable and fair individual. When she first entered our lives, I embraced her as the maternal figure I longed for. Even as a child, I endeavored to make her feel welcome, acknowledging her kindness and understanding nature. I truly believed she would never condone something so patently unjust. Yet now, her silence spoke volumes. She hasn't said a word to me or my father, and I can't help but suspect that it's because her daughter might benefit financially from the situation. Why stir up trouble if Eleanor could profit? It's disappointing, really. I expected more from her. I suppose I should have known better than to expect support from anyone in that household. It's increasingly obvious that distancing myself was the right choice, though it does little to ease the sting of betrayal. As for my father, he continues to maintain his stance, attempting to guilt-trip me with talk of family duties and responsibilities. But I've tuned him out. After all that's transpired, I refuse to let him manipulate me any further. It's bewildering to see how much he has changed. The man I once admired now seems like a stranger. Despite everything, the support from all of you has been invaluable during these tumultuous times. It's reassuring to know I'm not alone. Recently, things escalated unexpectedly when my father, accompanied by Eleanor, confronted me at my grandparents' home. He was aggressive, accusing me of abandoning the family and trying to turn my grandparents against him, while Eleanor played the silent, bewildered bystander. But I no longer buy her innocent facade, not after the ordeal with the educational fund. Any lingering doubts about keeping the money have vanished. There's no way I'm parting with a single cent after witnessing this charade. My father then proceeded with veiled legal threats, claiming he could contest his parents' assets because of his relation. His audacity astounded me, especially considering he had already diverted funds meant for me to Eleanor without a second thought. Now, he had the gall to try and guilt me into relinquishing the money my grandparents had given me from their savings. His actions were ludicrous, yet they opened my eyes even further to the realities of our fractured relationship. He continued to claim that they were under my influence, unable to make sound decisions, and he was adamant about defending his rights in court. At that moment, I was seething with anger. My father, who should have been concentrating on mending our strained relationship, seemed more focused on staking a claim to money that wasn't rightfully his. His actions struck me as exceedingly selfish, but my grandfather was quick to put an end to his antics. He firmly told my father that he was free to pursue legal action if he so desired, but he wouldn't gain anything from it. My grandfather, knowledgeable about legal matters, had ensured that everything was resolved long ago. Following the confrontation, my father's determination seemed to deflate, and Eleanor quietly trailed after him, her presence shadow-like. Any thoughts of sharing the inheritance with her vanished then. I was tired of trying to be the magnanimous one. The situation had already cost me my educational fund, my father's respect, and my standing in the family. I was determined not to lose anything more. Amid all this, surprisingly, my stepmother Sophia reached out. I was hesitant at first, assuming she might try to sway me on behalf of my father and Eleanor. However, when we met, it was clear she wasn't the same Sophia. She looked exhausted, as if the recent events had aged her significantly. She apologized for not intervening sooner, for not defending me when my father redirected my educational funds to Eleanor, and for letting the situation escalate. While I wasn't ready to forgive her completely, her sincerity was apparent. Sophia explained that the ordeal had taken a significant toll on her, revealing a side of my father she hadn't known existed. Despite her attempts to voice her concerns, my father dismissed her or ignored her outright, insisting that securing Eleanor's future was crucial, even at my expense. This misguided belief showed just how much he had changed. Sophia also revealed that she had tried multiple times to confront him about his unfair treatment towards me, but to no avail. Her revelations shed new light on the dynamics within our family, making me reconsider my approach to the entire situation. It wasn't just my father involved in the decision-making. Eleanor was also a full participant. She had been aware of every discussion about my education fund right from the start and knew exactly the source of the funds. Despite this, Eleanor never hesitated or objected to using money that wasn't rightfully hers. That realization was a turning point for me, erasing any last doubts I had about whether to share the money with her. It became clear that Eleanor didn't really care about me or the losses I had suffered. Her focus was solely on what she could gain for herself. Sophia, witnessing my father's extreme anger during a confrontation at my grandparents' house, began to see things differently. She had never seen him so enraged or irrational, and it frightened her. She admitted that she didn't want to be part of a family that could treat their own child so unfairly. His threats of legal action against my grandparents were the last straw for her. Sophia confided in me that she was seriously considering leaving him as she could no longer cope with his behavior. I was torn. Part of me wanted to encourage her to leave the chaos she had been part of creating, but another part of me couldn't fully trust her. After all, she had been complicit through her silence for so long, only choosing to act when the situation began affecting her directly. Although I acknowledged her apology, I couldn't simply forgive and forget because she was now having a change of heart. Regarding my father, I knew our relationship was beyond repair. Sophia seemed to understand my stance and didn't try to justify his actions any further. She apologized for the situation escalating to this point and expressed regret for not acting sooner. It was a rare moment of vulnerability for her, but I couldn't allow myself to get too caught up in her emotions. I had been let down too many times before. After our conversation, I went back to my grandparents' house. They were surprised that Sophia had reached out, but remained skeptical of her intentions. My grandfather, in particular, advised me to remain cautious, reminding me that Sophia was still connected to my father and could not be fully trusted. On top of all this, my father continued to send me messages, trying to convince me that I owed something to Eleanor and that sharing the money would be best for the family. But after everything he had done and all the pain he had caused, his expectations seemed almost absurd. I was determined not to yield to his demands or play the role of the compliant daughter any longer. I had already lost too much: my education fund, my relationship with my father, and my sense of belonging in my own family. Now, I'm focused on moving forward. Following my grandparents' advice, I hired a financial advisor to help manage the funds. I'm still young and eager to avoid any financial missteps, especially given my father's unpredictable behavior. I'm looking forward to starting business school and leaving this turmoil behind. It's time for me to concentrate on building a future that doesn't include my father's manipulations or Eleanor's entitlement. I've realized that all I need are my grandparents and myself. That's more than enough.